Hello everyone, and welcome to this Multilingual Matters online event. I'm Laura Jordan, the commissioning editor for our Psychology of Language Learning and Teaching series. I'm delighted to be joined here today by the series editors for the series, Sarah Mercer from the University of Graz and Stephen Ryan from Waseda University, as well as two of our most recently published authors, Gary Barkhuizen, who will be talking about his book, Language Teachers Studying Abroad, and Chika Takahashi will be speaking about her work, Motivation to Learn Multiple Languages in Japan. At the end of the event, there'll be an opportunity for some audience questions. Please use Zoom's question and answer tool to post any questions to us during the event. My colleague Eleanor will be keeping an eye on submissions and will pick some to be answered by the panelists later in the session. At the end, we'll also be giving you a discount code at the end of the event, which you can use to get 50% off any books in the series. So please stay tuned for that as well. And now I'll hand over to Sarah and Stephen, who will give an introduction to the series before speaking to Gary. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura. Should I go ahead, Sarah, just give some background here? I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and the origins of our series, but before I do that, maybe I should actually talk about what a series is, because for some of us outside the publishing world, a series is just what it seems just like some kind of device publishers use for cataloging their catalogs, and that's certainly how I thought of them when I was outside the loop. But actually, for authors and for readers, these series are very important because they bring focus to books and to research. If you're an author, a series sort of connects you with the right people, both in terms of your audience and in terms of people who are actually going to help you through the process. You get, when you submit your first proposal, if you're connected to the correct series, you get sympathetic, knowledgeable people involved with your work, and you get this kind of support all the way through the process. And this support is important because it is a long process writing a book, and being connected to the best people will help you produce, realize the potential of your research. Specifically, the PLLT series originated from, well, in my version of this story, it came up from Sarah, my own personal experience of sort of, I guess, struggling to get published, finding the correct audience for our work. That sometimes we were sort of, we couldn't really find the best outlet for our research, and we were getting feedback, we were getting comments that that was valid, but perhaps didn't, perhaps the wrong people were reading it, what we were hearing, it was good, but what we wanted to say. So I've got somebody sitting down next to me, just disturbing me here. So it was valid, but at the same time, we thought there was a better way and for our work to be seen, read by other people. And we thought, well, we try this outlet, but then we thought probably the best way to do it is create our own. That was Sarah's way of doing it. That's how Sarah does everything, actually. And then we got into this idea, and obviously our first port of call was Multilingual Matters, because they're the people who'd always been supportive, understanding of our work in the past. And it was the best decision. It was a wonderful decision for us, because we did get such great support and from them. And we started back in 2016. This was the very first book, I think, going back. It seems a long time ago. And from my own perspective, one of the things I'm most proud of in this series is that one of our key aims was to get an outlet for novice researchers to get published, and to encourage people who had never been published before to take the plunge. But the other side was, we've got a balance with experienced authors too, people with really established names. And I really like that. I'm very proud of that in our series. And I think that's reflected in our two special guests today. And I think, Sarah, you want to talk a bit more about our guests in our series in more detail?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. That gives a great background to the series. So for those of you who are not familiar with psychology of language learning and teaching, this is kind of a broad field. It started with a kind of heritage in learner individual differences, but over the years it's broadened considerably and has moved away from being just about motivation and has opened up to a whole range of other things to do with identity, attitudes, anxiety, self-concept, the whole area of positive psychology. So it's anything to do with the field of how we think and learn and act as human beings. Now, one of the things that Stephen and I were really sort of quite passionate about at the beginning is we didn't want it to be the notion that this was psychology shouldn't be associated with a particular view of what that is. Now, it's a field of inquiry. It doesn't say how you approach that. So there has been this kind of myth in the field that this is associated with cognition only, and that's just not true. That's a sort of a myth that's associated with that heritage, perhaps in learner individual differences. And so one of the things I think that Stephen and I and Laura are particularly proud of as hosting the series is that it has grown to have a wonderful spread of different theoretical approaches, methodological approaches. It has got, as you can see in the talk today, it's looking at teachers and learners. It's looking at English, but also languages other than English as well. So I think we're very proud of the theoretical, conceptual, methodological, and contextual diversity that the series has managed to embrace. And we're very keen to keep furthering that as we move it forward. So far, the series has got nearly 20 books, I think, in the series that are already published. There are 11 lurking behind the scenes. Watch this space. You don't know what's coming, but we do. There are 11 fantastic books in preparation. And even in the last couple of weeks, we've got another set of new submissions and new books that are under discussion for whether they're going to join the series or not. So it's great to see it as a very vibrant, very active series. And as Stephen said, in a very short space of time, it's absolutely blossomed. And we're very proud that Gary and Chika wanted to position their work within our series. I'll go straight over. I'm going to, I know that Stephen's going to talk with Chika and I'm going to talk with Gary. So if I may, I'll go straight over to Gary. Gary, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Okay, my name is Gary Barkhuizen. I'm at the University of Auckland here in New Zealand on a Thursday evening. I've just been experiencing some terrible flooding and lots of cyclones and rain. But we've survived, and I'm very happy to be here and happy to talk about this really interesting book and to take any questions later on.
Brilliant, thank you, Gary. So I have Gary's book here for those of you who want to take a little look at that. There you go, showing off now. Have you got the hard copy or the paperback? See, that's the question.
Hard copy.
Yeah, then you show.
I dropped on my foot earlier. I dropped on my foot. I've got a cut to prove it.
So this is a fantastic book, an edited collection. I love it, of course, because it's about language teachers and language teacher educators. So it's opening up that perspective in PLL, and it's also about the context of study abroad and putting that psychological lens, looking at things like identities, emotions, and so on. Gary, do you want to talk a little bit about what gave you the idea for the book, how it's turned out, how happy you are with it? Just give a little overview of it, maybe.
Okay. In 2019, I managed to get some funding from our faculty here at the university to establish a group of researchers who were interested in language teachers studying abroad. And the plan was for us to get together to exchange ideas about this research topic, to find out ways how we could collaborate together to come up with different topics, maybe to form some smaller teams to do research in this area and to apply for funding. The funding that we did get from the faculty also allowed us to invite an international expert in the field to come to the university. And we had included in this funding was the opportunity to have a one-day seminar where I could invite people from other parts of New Zealand. So we had quite ambitious plans with some backup funding to explore this idea. And the main reason for wanting to explore the idea was that we get a lot of international students coming to the University of Auckland, and many of those students are in fact teachers, either wanting to become teachers or are already teachers, sometimes with years of experience doing our master's and PhD programs and so on. So I just felt that we didn't really explore, we don't know enough about these particular group of teachers. Yes, we know about them from an international education perspective, but not that much from a study abroad perspective, which is a little bit different. So I was really interested to get together people who were wanting to explore this and wanting to research this particular group of students who came as international students to the university, and the university loves that, of course, but what are their study abroad experiences? And so we managed to get a group together. We met, and I was surprised to see that there was this interest. We got together, we divided into subgroups. We had plans. In fact, I invited an international guest. And then, of course, COVID struck, right? And so with study abroad, we know what happened. We all had these experiences of what happened with international travel. And so that affected study abroad as well. And so all our plans were just abandoned to a certain extent. But this funding was still there. And so I was working with Rosemary Vetter at the time, who was associated with this particular project. And I think I was talking to Sarah about something, and I think she may have mentioned, do you have any ideas for, like Sarah does, for a book for the series? And we thought, well, since we'd all got together and we'd established this interest, maybe we could put together an edited book on this topic. So there were a few people who were interested in contributing to the book, and some from that original group do have chapters in the book. But it was obviously important to spread more broadly in terms of trying to capture the experiences of teachers who study abroad. And I just did a quick count. I think from the contributions, we've got host and home countries, if I could call that, up to about 35, 40 different countries from around the world. So there's a number from New Zealand, but they go all the way on all continents around the world. So a lot of countries represented, both in terms of sending teachers around the world and also hosting teachers. So there's a very broad spread of experiences. And what we really wanted was to capture the experiences of these language teachers who go and study abroad. Who exactly are the language teachers who participate in language teachers studying abroad? And so we brought it all together in one place in this book. So I'll just stop there, Sarah, and I could go on forever, but I'll just stop there and answer any questions that come later.
I think that gives a good feel of the book, and I have to say it covers an enormous amount of ground, covering different aspects and, as you say, different contexts. And perhaps the first sort of contextual element I'll pick up on is, what is the difference between looking at teachers and looking at learners? In what way might they be a different population to look at in the context of study abroad?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of similarity, right? Especially when you're looking at people involved in language, because there's language learning that takes place. So for language learners, of course, the main goal is to go and learn the language. And so you do language courses, language classes, and so on in the host country. That's the purpose. And teachers, of course, who go specifically as teachers studying abroad also do what I've called one of my themes, language enhancement. So although they may not formally do language learning as part of their program, they would, by engaging in the host community, would attempt to learn the language of the host community. So there are a lot of commonalities also in terms of personal development, self-growth, intercultural learning, and so on. But the main difference, of course, is professional development, because what teachers doing when they're going to study abroad is often get involved in some sort of internship, some volunteer teaching. Maybe it's for a practicum, or sometimes even work abroad, which is a sort of subcategory, I guess, of study abroad. So that professional development aspect, being a teacher, learning to be a teacher, reflecting on one's current and future life as a teacher, one's future career as a teacher, even many years later, is an important component of LTSA, language teachers studying abroad.
Actually, it's quite funny you should say that, Gary, because actually your book inspired one of my students who's just done a master's thesis, and she's looked at people who've been already back from their stay abroad, practicing teachers who've been back for a minimum of 10 years. and how they now retrospectively reflect on that stay abroad and the impact that it's had on their professional practice. And that's also been extremely interesting. But you'll be pleased to know that I was inspired by this book and your work. So.
Oh, good. Yes. Yeah. What the book covers is not only while abroad, but also the post-sojourn or the post-study abroad period as well, and often many years later. So there are some chapters where the researchers have looked at the long-lasting effects of study abroad well into the careers of teachers. And there's a couple of autoethnographies and duoethnography as well, where many years later, 2 teacher educators, for example, have looked at their experiences of study abroad and working abroad throughout their lives, and how it's affected their career throughout their lives many years later.
Now, you mentioned just briefly before that you got certain themes, and in the introductory chapter, you identify 12 main themes, that, if I'm not putting you too much on the spot here, that you pull out of issues that are raised throughout these different chapters. And do you want to comment about any of those that you think are particularly important or particularly salient at the moment, or play a particular role at the moment in society?
Yeah, okay. So as you say, there were these 12 themes that covered a whole range of aspects of study abroad that are relevant to the lives of teachers, particularly relevant to the lives of teachers. One of them is language enhancement, which is common to language learners as well. But there were 4 that I think stand out. I won't have time for all of them, but I'll just mention them. 4 of these themes that I think were really important, not only for language teachers, but for all study abroad people, and particularly at this time where we're going through so many changes in our lives and so many changes in education, particularly language education. And one of these themes, which is the first one I mentioned, is the theme of disruption. And I don't only mean COVID-19 disruption, but disruption also perhaps in a positive sense, when experienced teachers, for example, who go on study abroad, perhaps on a PhD sojourn, or maybe as a teacher educator who are involved in a study abroad, their normal, usual practice gets disrupted in some way, whether it's cultural disruption or emotional disruption or identity disruption. And as I say, this could not necessarily a bad thing, but it could be what one author talks, an encounter with difference. And so this difference, it does something to you. It awakens something, or it shakes something up. It stimulates some growth or some reflection. This disruption is something that runs throughout all the chapters, whether the authors call it disruption or not. So this is a theme that I picked up that was pretty much a common thread running through the chapters. Another one had to do with relationships. And I think the relationships that the teachers experienced with their colleagues while on study abroad, with members of the host community, and then when returning, the relationships they established back again in the domestic situation with learners, with imagined future learners as well. This idea of relationships was very important. And a number of authors in the books were very critical sometimes of these relationships, particularly when power became an issue. So language teachers, for example, going to a particular host community are sometimes critiqued for what they take from that community, rather than negotiating with the community. So there's some sort of sharing in the study abroad context, rather than just, popping in as a visitor and observing and then leaving. So that type of relationship is quite a destructive relationship, for example. So there's some quite critical observations of the relationships that teachers experience. And these have emotional implications for the teachers, because sometimes what they experience, what they see, is quite disruptive, quite jarring for them in terms of the relationships with the people they engage with while on study abroad. And again, this could be quite long-lasting for when they get back to their own communities, their own schools, their own teacher education programs. And these memories last, right? And the relationships last. They maintain contact with people from the study abroad and so on. So relationships were very important. I mentioned professional development as a theme that obviously inevitably runs throughout all of the chapters. So I won't talk about that, but that was another important theme. And then another one, the final one I'll talk about, is one I've called critical reflexivity. So this is where the language teachers, while on study abroad and post-study abroad, really start to look inwards. They start to look at themselves as people, as individuals, but also as professionals. So they reflexively look inwards to see who they are, how they're developing, who are the people they are engaging with. And they do it from a very critical perspective, often with the support of mentors or the teacher educators who are accompanying them. And this often leads to different levels of political awareness that surprised sometimes the language teachers while they were abroad. Often naively going into places, encountering different cultures, different ways of doing education, ways of doing language teaching and learning, and being quite surprised by what they learn politically, not only on a micro level within a school, but also in terms of national policies, language education policies that come from ministries of education, for example. So this critical reflexivity is something that was often encouraged by the teacher education programs while on study abroad, but often happened individually without notice and without warning, individually by the language teachers while they were on study abroad, and particularly post-study abroad, often followed up in courses and post-sojourn work in a particular program.
It's actually really interesting, Gary, because I did a study abroad stay as part of my degree. So not wishing to age myself, but about 30 years ago. And reading your book, one of the things that it did was it made me look back at that experience through a slightly different, more critical lens. And I certainly approached my stay abroad in, the word you just used was naively. I had no preparation. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. I was totally unprepared. And reading this book, I'm thinking how different my experience might have been. I had a great experience, I have to say, but there was a very strong naivety to it. So I suppose my final question is, what would be some of the practical lessons that people might take from this collection?
Yeah, what I asked the authors to do in their chapters was to have an implication section at the end of each chapter. So most of them did that. And so there are some practical implications throughout the book. And these are relevant for teachers, of course, for teachers who are going on study abroad. There's some quite useful things. It's not a set of guidelines. It's not a book that's aimed at program designers, although it may be very useful for them. But there are implications for teachers who are going on study abroad, and particularly teacher educators who may be mentoring or maybe accompanying the language teachers while they go on study abroad. And this is really useful for preparation for the study abroad program, and also for the return, because that's often neglected in study abroad programs, particularly for language teachers. One just assumes that they can manage things themselves when they get back. With language learners, there's often much more support when they return. But for language teachers, they often just get on with it. You have your experience now, it's up to you. But many of the chapters say that there should be the follow-up, either in formal courses or in a series of workshops or in some other reflective activities that are designed for the teachers when they get back. So for the teacher educators, for the programs themselves, for the teachers, and also for those who do design these programs, who may have more administrative type roles. But the other main one, of course, is for researchers in this particular field of study abroad, of international education, of global studies, people who do research, because there's a vast range of different research methodologies that are used throughout the book. Many of them are qualitative, many of them are narrative, particularly, but they all are excellent examples of how we can explore the whole person, the whole language teacher in the study abroad experience. So lovely examples. And often the authors will note some limitations and ideas for further research as well. So how to extend their methodologies in some way. So for researchers in this area, I think the implications are quite powerful for them too.
Gary, thank you so much for sharing your insights to the book. I can only say from experience, there's so much in here for people interested in study abroad, research methodology, but also some of the notions, the identity, this idea of disruption, critical reflexivity, identities, emotions, attitudes, all of that is in there. So I think it's a very rich resource for anybody interested in PLLT, study abroad, or also the methodologies. I'm going to hand over now to Stephen and Chika to find out about the second book in our series. Thank you, Gary.
Okay. Thanks, both of you. Actually, I'm just sort of thinking about my own study abroad experience here. I kind of forgot what I was supposed to be talking about. Okay, so I'm supposed to be talking about this Chika's book, which I probably shouldn't say this, but I do have this has a special place in my heart, this one in our series, because I sort of remember the very first sort of tentative emails from you and about should I do this, and it was watching the whole growth of this book, the development, and finally I found in the past few months I keep recommending this book to so many people, and I'm just so proud of what you've done. It's an amazing achievement. So rather than me talk about it, why don't you tell the audience about your book and some of the main themes and what you saying through this book?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Chika Takahashi. I'm at Ehime University, which is in the smallest island of the 4 main islands in Japan. And as Stephen just said, it's my very, very first book. It's actually, I had never actually written even a chapter in a book. So everything was new, and I learned so much from the experience. So my book, it's a book about 2 Japanese learners of multiple languages, focusing on their long-term motivational trajectories. And it's a longitudinal case study, mainly utilizing interviews. And the study originally started as part of my dissertation, which ended up lasting 9 years in total. In 2021. So I was working on my dissertation in 2012. And so it's really a long study. I did 16 sets of individual interviews with my 2 wonderful interviewees. And it really means a lot to me to publish this book, both professionally and personally, in many ways. And let me first talk about some important topics in this book. First, of course, is the long-term motivation. And my thoughts at the time of writing my dissertation is that learning any second language usually takes years to reach a certain level of proficiency, I believe, for any people. And yet at that time, I was finding a lot more studies on the 2 aspects of motivation, which are the choice and effort, but much fewer studies on persistence, the aspect of persistence. So how long they are willing to continue this their language learning. And but I was particularly interested in this aspect of motivation, partly because of my professional experience of working as a materials designer for these TV and radio self-instructional materials. And while I was working as a materials designer, I was finding that a lot of learners, rather than persisting in their studies, dropped out, really easily dropped out after maybe a couple of months. And it's of course natural that they do so because they don't, for example, get credits or they don't get teacher feedback. So they usually have to work on their own. And yet, I was also finding out that there are many people who do persist in this type of learning for years in some cases. So I really got interested in what led to these differences between persistence and non-persistence. And after reading relevant literature and also conducting a preliminary study, I found out that it's probably the issue of motivation. So one of the topics is the issue of persistence. And another important one, I should say, particularly for a study from Japan, is the aspect of motivation to learn languages other than English, not English. So I called it load motivation in the book. But I have to say that there have been very, very few studies on load motivation from Japan. And there are so many contextual and educational factors behind this lack of studies. But if we look at studies internationally, of course, we have been seeing steady growth of load motivation studies. And so whenever I was reading a study on load motivation, of course, I was learning a lot and I was fascinated by those studies. But at the same time, I kind of felt this, how can I say it, uneasiness about the differences between what these studies focused on and the realities of load learners in Japan. Recently, low education in Japan, I have to say, is not so emphasized even at the tertiary level, and the situations are really different from other countries. But my two interviewees studied really multiple languages. I'm sure you'll be fascinated by their stories, and I was also fascinated by how much they enjoyed their studies. And so that I thought really added diversity to load motivation literature, I mean, on the international level. So and just as Gary, I could go on and on, but I should probably stop here so that I can answer any questions.
No, feel free to go on and on, please. It was, but maybe I could just draw you back to the actual series itself, the themes of the various themes in your book. Was there anything that particularly you feel is particularly relevant to the PLLT series? You know, why did you think your book was a good fit for us?
Mm-hmm. Right. I have to admit that as a first-time author, I was really very much intimidated by about contacting you and contacting Laura and everyone, because I was always a reader of the series and I never imagined that I could be an author in the series. So that was my feeling at the time. But I really wanted to examine my interviewees' long-term development from a broad perspective. And first of all, a journal article would not be enough. I really needed to publish a book, I thought. And of course, Multilingual Matters had different series, and I contemplated on which one would be most suitable. And of course, my top choice was PLLT because it had a lot of different elements. First of all, it had a lot of books on motivation, of course. And I also have to say that there was also a methodological diversity in the series. So my study would be a good fit, I thought, because I did not know any study that lasted 9 years. And sometimes researchers do longitudinal studies on load motivation or L2 motivation, but usually maybe up to 2 years or so. So I thought that I could contribute in some way in that regard. And also, one of the biggest reasons is that the readers, the audience that I wanted to reach was readers and authors of this series. So whenever I was reading studies on load motivation, I wanted to really talk to them, reach them, and tell them about situations in Japan. And also, my study is a really positive story, I should say, because of course there are motivational ups and downs along the way between the two interviewees, but they really held a positive attitude toward their language learning, of multiple languages. And at the time before writing this book, I was reading about so many studies that examined negative interactions between, for example, English and load motivation. And in most cases, English negatively affected their load motivation because they considered that they could just get by with global English. But their story was clearly different. So so in those senses, I thought that I could contribute in some way, and PLNT series would be the greatest fit, I thought.
Okay, Daniel, thanks for picking up on the sort of methodological diversity within our series. That's something we're particularly proud of, and we like to encourage. And another thing we have in this series, we like to think there's a lot of we're sort of pedagogically grounded, and I wondered, what the sort of takeaways for educators or even learners from your book? Do you have anything to say on that front?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So as I said, it's a story of two wonderful learners who considered that language learning is a lifelong endeavor, which is an essentially human act that better connects us to other people. And so my take on a lot of learners is that a lot of times they're too much focused on this instrumentalist view of language learning, that learning, particularly English, would bring them economic benefit. And of course, that's true. And that may be acutely felt in certain contexts in particular. But learning a language can be also really enjoyable and positive. And I should say that language educators can emphasize that learning a language is not just about gaining a competitive edge in the job market, for example. It really, my interviewees, Yuzuru and Shion, really showed that by learning a language, they can be closer to people of those languages. And that's why they didn't stop at just studying English, but they continue to study different languages. It's just amazing that every time I interviewed them, particularly for Yuzuru, the particular languages that that he was not learning kept increasing. So I learned so much from them as well. So I want to say that language educators and learners, of course, can kind of really think about what language and language learning mean to them, not just about in a narrow sense, but if they were to study it through their entire life, what would it be like?
Okay, I'm conscious of the time here, and I really do want you to go on and on, as you said, you promised, but I got one final question for you here, and it's more, you did say as a first-time author, you found us intimidating.
Yes.
I'm sure you meant Sarah, not me, in that sense, but perhaps as part of one of our sort of goals in this little event is to encourage other first-time authors to sort of take up the challenge. And now, as an established author, maybe you could sort of give some advice or talk about some of the challenges you faced, some of the little advice for anybody out there who's thinking about taking the plunge.
Sure. I wouldn't still describe myself as an experienced author, but first of all, I would say that we really need to think about the differences between journal articles and books, and whether to publish. In my case, I really thought about whether to publish my study in Japanese with a Japanese publisher or with a publisher like Multilingual Matters. And I also thought about which series would be suitable, as I said. And one of the things that I can say is that really think about the audience. Who are you trying to reach? And if they are the ones that are maybe authors of that series, then it probably means a good fit. And also, I would say that just don't give up just because you have never published a book, I would say. Everyone was really supportive from the very beginning, and I felt that that the atmosphere was really different from publishing a journal article, because everyone was trying to help so that my volume would be better. And so the whole experience, I would say, was really enjoyable, and I learned a whole lot. And if you believe in the value of your study, I would definitely say go for it.
Thanks. You took the words right out of my mouth there, Chika. So that's my message to everybody out there. But I can see actually the questions are sort of coming in thick and fast here. So I'm going to hand over to Laura. Do you want to manage this?
Yes, yeah, absolutely fine. Yeah, I mean, thank you both and all four of you for such an interesting discussion. We have a wealth of questions come in, so we're going to do our best to get through them all. Gary, we'll start with you. I mean, personally, when you spoke about the encounters with difference and it really doing something to you, I found that really interesting. And Pinar has a question slightly related to that, about whether it needs to be face-to-face or whether online education, such relationships can also support professional development.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for it. There is one chapter in the book which talks about a virtual exchange where during COVID, when this is between New Zealand and Germany, for example, and language learners in New Zealand and language teacher trainers and language teacher trainees in Germany. And so they did a virtual exchange study abroad. So they didn't visit each other's country. So it's quite possible. So there was a contact in New Zealand and a contact in Germany, and they set up a way of sharing information about each other's countries. But there were particular tasks involved as well. And it was all about how it worked out and what the challenges were for those involved. Not only technological challenges, but emotional and relationship challenges, particularly where things fell flat. There was another one where, and a number of others, in fact, where before study abroad and after study abroad, there was a lot of online preparation before the study abroad. And then the study abroad took place for a short or longer time. And then the follow-up, there'd often be a lot of Zoom meetings, a lot of co-teaching online after study abroad, for example. So there were sort of blended approaches. So yes, it can be, and a lot of it was forced onto the participants because of COVID. There was one case where a student from a pre-service teacher from Japan went to Taiwan and got stuck there because he couldn't get back to Japan. And so what he did was he studied online at a Taiwanese university in Taiwan, doing study abroad. So it was a rather interesting sort of connection. And in the same study, from the same university, a student from Japan was in Sweden. And she basically caught the last flight out. She was told to get out of Sweden, go back to Japan. And so she left. So two participants from the same study had quite different experiences. Yeah, so certainly in reply to that question, yes, there can certainly be online virtual exchanges and blended approaches as well.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Then we've got a question now for Chika. It comes from Sarah, and she asked what advice you would have for a PhD student interested in researching long-term motivation and the changes that happen during the time of the study. She's especially wondering this as there are so many factors affecting motivation, so how to get a truly comprehensive and holistic view. So any advice you've got?
So the first part, I think, would be about turning a PhD thesis to a book. And for that matter, I don't know if I can give good advice, because it's, in my case, the dissertation only covers the first 2 interviews, which were conducted half a year apart. And so that was in 2012. But then the rest of the study continued after I had finished my degree. But one thing I can say, that I can say is that it's really different. I mean, a dissertation and a book, and you need to probably cut some part of your dissertation and add a lot more in a book. I mean, considering the difference between the audience. I mean, the dissertation is basically for the committee. The committee members are the ones who read your dissertation, right? But when you're turning it to a book, it's a whole lot of different researchers around the world, and maybe language teachers. And so at least I can say that it's important to think about the difference in audience. Sarah, do you have any other good advice?
No, I think that's good advice. I think you made the point clearly that a PhD and a book are different things. So this is a kind of word of warning for anybody who thinks they can just submit their PhD thesis and it'll be a book. It doesn't work like that, because they're very different functions and purposes. I think you make that point very well. I think your study is exceptional because it's this 9-year longitudinal study. I mean, I really don't know of many studies that have got that depth and that richness and that quality of data over such a long period of time. So it's quite unusual and very, very special. In terms of other people who want to do longitudinal research, you really don't want your PhD to last 9 years. So I can see that, isn't really good advice in that regard. But a longitudinal study, for me, this holistic, but this is also a methodological bias that I have, is I love narratives and interviews. I like that qualitative data to get that holistic view, because, as the question asks, it's such a complex process over time, that this holistic perspective that is facilitated through qualitative methodologies, for me, like you, Chika, and also Gary, I think that's a richer avenue, I find, for exploring if you want to capture that complexity over such a long period of time.
I agree.
Yeah, superb advice. Thank you both. So we're now going to move on to the topic of autonomy, Gary. So Eman is asking how study abroad could impact the autonomy, and particularly autonomy as teachers.
Yeah, I actually saw that question. So I went to the index quickly to see if there's anything about autonomy in the book. And there were a couple of mentions of autonomy in terms of after teachers had engaged in study abroad, returning to their home country, especially if they've been involved in a formal teacher education program of some sort, and gone back to teaching in the same setting where they taught before. They feel that they've got more sort of confidence. And even in quite constrained institutional contexts, they feel that they have more autonomy there as well. So they're able to work within those constraints much more efficiently and much more confidently. So those were the only real comments about autonomy from the teacher's perspective. But what did come up a number of times also was that the teachers often said when they go back to their domestic situations, they'd like to promote autonomy in their learners. So that was rather interesting, because they hadn't really thought of that before. So the experiences abroad had raised this awareness of autonomy for them. And it was something that they thought they would desire to implement in their domestic language teaching situations to enable their learners to have more autonomy. And they even thought of different sort of pedagogical methods for of creating opportunities for autonomy in their learners. So yeah, so that was the only sort of thing that came up with autonomy. And I guess, you know, we talk about teacher autonomy sometimes, and I think that comes together with self-efficacy, with confidence, with self-growth, and so on. I think they all combine. It's hard to look at autonomy just as one thing.
Thank you, Gary. Now, Chika, we've got a question for you here from Elizabeth. She asked whether you make any difference between motivation and engagement. She perceives engagement more as a deep-going concept, but she'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. So my study is on motivation, and I also read another question regarding the theoretical framework that I had, and I mainly focused on the ideal L2 self, ideal multilingual self, as well as intrinsic motivation. So these were led by two major theories. And if I were to examine engagement, maybe I might have chosen a different method because, first of all, I also read another question regarding my participants. So these were two interviewees that I met when they were in the second year of high school, and I finished the study when one of them was about to finish his master's degree, and the other had already been in the professional work for a year. But because these were interview studies, I did not really look into the actual learning or engagement. I asked questions in the interviews, but if I were to look into more of the engagement, I would try to get closer to their learning environment. And for example, I was not their teacher. We went to the same high school, but and I knew their teacher, but so I would clearly describe my study as a motivation study, not an engagement study.
Yeah, thank you, Chika. So we'll pop back to Gary now. We've got a question from Kerry about whether when teachers return from their time abroad, whether they have a different attitude towards EFL, such as a more inclusive attitude, recognising multilingualism and native speaker norms.
Yeah, in short, yes. I think just about all the findings from the chapters indicate that. There's a sort of eye-opening that happens in study abroad. And I mean, that's not to say that always happens, but I think across the chapters, there was this definite, discovery of different understandings of what, the example of EFL, what English means, and what multilingualism means, particularly learners who came from, countries where, or came from institutions or from regions where they hadn't experienced the diversity that they come across when they are on study abroad. And it also depends, of course, on the length of time that they're on board. But even very short stays of, 2 weeks, if they're quite intensive and they go on field trips, that can be quite shocking to them when compared to their own backgrounds and their own experiences. So, and again, if this comes along with appropriate teacher education, appropriate activities, appropriate support, I think that's very important always. And for most of the chapters, the type of study abroad that's described are sort of part of a program of some sort. So there's always this the opportunity for support, the opportunity for further learning that's provided along the way. Not all of the chapters are like that. Many of them are sort of autoethnographies. I see there's a question about that as well, or even autobiographies in a sense. But where people go on independent study, so that's quite different. But I think if there is this support, then that can be much more encouraged. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. I just looked at the clock and I see we're coming up towards 10 o'clock, but I'm hopeful we'll be able to fit in just a couple more questions each. And so Chika, we've got a question here from Dorota, who asks about the practicalities. So how you selected your participants and whether you can tell us a bit about that process and also whether they are typical motivation cases.
Okay, first of all, I should say that they are not typical cases. They certainly are not. So everything started in my dissertation, and I was first of all trying to look into a place where I could collect data, and it was a mixed method study where I would first collect or administer a questionnaire, and I asked the respondents to provide me with their contact details if they were willing to be individually interviewed. And I was able to interview 13 in the beginning. And for the second set of interviews, I intentionally decreased the number to 5 for a reason that I don't really have time to be describing. But then among the 5, they just, the 2 seemed to me to be really contrasting yet really wonderful learners. And in high school, they were already studying Chinese, which is really atypical in Japan. And so I contacted those 2 as well as the other 3 that I had interviewed for the second time. And they are the ones who never said no to my invitation. And they ended up being really contrasting, but again, both really fascinating learners. So I wouldn't say that they are typical Japanese learners, because most of them only learn English or maybe English plus 1 load, but they both learned multiple languages, including English and multiple loads. So there's certainly the issue of whether the participants are willing to be interviewed so many times, but I have to say that I was just simply lucky.
Thank you, Chika. So we're going to squeeze in one quick last question for Gary, as there are still so many questions. So this attendee is wondering if there's any reflection in the book about how language teachers feel upon returning to their home country.
Yeah, every single chapter does that. And that is so varied because the experiences are so varied. So many of the teachers feel, elated and inspired and thrilled with all their new experiences, and they can't wait to get back to implement all the new knowledge that they've acquired while away. And they on a personal level, emotional ups and downs of seeing the family again, because sometimes the study abroad involves being away for a whole year. And it's amazing the sacrifices that some people make. They leave their entire family behind and they go and study abroad for a year, sometimes even an entire degree away. So there are these massive sacrifices that people make to go and study abroad. And that raises a lot of questions about, who does study abroad and why this motivation to study abroad and how are they able to study abroad? And also, who does not study abroad and what prevents them from study abroad? Why can't they study abroad? So it raises a lot of questions. These emotional aspects about the whole experience and about returning, not only on a personal level, but also a professional level. So there are massive expectations sometimes placed on teachers who return to their domestic situation. So we have a number of teachers who come from Cambodia and they study with us and do a master's degree. It's a 1-year master's degree. And in the study, my own chapter in the book with Rosemary Vetter, we did follow-up interviews back in Cambodia with some of these teachers. And suddenly they pushed into management positions just because they've now got a master's. And they've been, they didn't study management, but they suddenly find themselves in leadership positions, managing projects. And this is a few weeks after having returned from doing their master's into the same school, the same institution where they were. So there are massive expectations for the language teachers who return. Some, of course, just slot straight back into a program after being away 2 or 3 weeks. So it's very different. So it's very variable.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gary. And I see the clock has literally just ticked over to 10 o'clock here in the UK. So it's time for me to wrap up the event. But I'd like to say a really big thank you to all our panelists for speaking today. It's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you very much to everyone who's joined us from wherever they are in the world. I did promise a discount code. So if you'd like to buy any of the books today or in the series, we're offering the code PLLT50, which gives you 50% off books on our website. Thank you very much again for joining us, and we'll hope you'll attend another event in the future soon. That's all from us. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.